Hello, and welcome to Your Vote Counts. I am Cindy Condon from the Salem City Club and League of Women Voters, bringing you this public information service program. These 2020 general election interviews are made possible through Capital Community Media via remote technology and in collaboration with the League of Women Voters of Oregon and Marion Polk counties. For this race, all candidates were invited. Candidates did not receive the questions developed by the League of Women Voters, American Association of University Women, Salem City Club, and neighborhood associations ahead of time. The candidates were asked to prepare a 3-minute statement telling about themselves, their qualifications, and their vision for the office if elected, and then answer our questions. I'm speaking with Shemia Fagan, the Democratic candidate for the office of Secretary of State. Thank you, Shemia, for participating in Your Vote Count. Let's begin with your opening remark.
Well, thank you, Cindy, and the Salem League of Women Voters and all of the organizations that are participating. I first want to just start by saying that these are incredibly challenging times for our world, our country, and our state. And I sincerely hope that you and your loved ones are safe right now. And I know that we all join together in our empathy and our heartbreak for our Oregon neighbors who in the past couple of weeks have lost loved ones, have lost homes, have lost beloved pets, and have lost irreplaceable belongings. And I know personally when I have seen little towns like Talent and Detroit and others suffering just immeasurable loss. It's especially eye opening for me because I grew up in little towns just like that in Wasco County. I grew up in the Dalles and Dufur. And my mom was in and out of our lives because she battled addiction and homelessness for most of my childhood. And my dad was raising 3 kids by himself as a single parent. And it's fair to say that we were hanging on by a thread. And in fact, one summer, the summer before I started second grade, which really comes full circle for me because my oldest started second grade this year, my dad took us on a cool camping trip. I remember being camping for a couple of weeks, catching crawdads, roasting marshmallows. And it wasn't until much later in life that my brothers told me actually we were homeless. We'd been evicted from our home in the Dalles and we had nowhere to go. And so dad took us on a camping trip so that we wouldn't know. And so that's why I have spent my career as a lawmaker and a civil rights attorney here in Oregon, fighting for other families who were hanging on by a thread. And we passed legislation like paid sick leave and raising the minimum wage here in Oregon. But I've also worked to, knock down barriers to participation in our democracy, from automatic voter registration to campaign finance reform and expanding vote by mail with prepaid postage. But Cindy, when I announced my campaign for Secretary of State, I quickly learned that most people have no idea what this job is. One of my older brothers asked me, Secretary of State, so you'll get people's coffee and stuff? So let me start there quickly, that this job at its core, it's to make sure that government works for everybody, from running free and fair elections to auditing state revenues and programs to make sure they make a difference and a real difference in the lives of people who need them most, overseeing public records to make sure that our government is transparent and accountable, and running the Oregon Small Business Assistance that I helped create in my first term in the Oregon House in the Secretary of State's office, helping Main Street businesses start up and thrive here in Oregon. As Secretary of State, I get to ensure that government makes a real difference in the lives of everyday Oregonians, and I would love to have your vote for Secretary of State.
Well, thank you for those opening comments. It sounds like you have a busy life just outside of running a campaign. So let's get our first question going. Of the many responsibilities of the Secretary of State, which do you consider the most difficult? And then following up on that, and I'll remind you, is the one of which Oregonians know about the least?
2 questions. So the one I consider the most difficult is the one I consider the most important. We have got to run free and fair and secure elections here in Oregon. As the chief elections officer, I believe that is the most important role of Oregon's Secretary of State. And particularly at a time when our pioneering, trailblazing vote by mail system that has worked For over 2 decades, I've never voted any other way than vote by mail here in Oregon is suddenly under attack and under scrutiny when we know as Oregonians, whether folks are independent, Republicans, Democrats, Green Party, Libertarians, Constitution Party, our vote by mail system has worked seamlessly here in Oregon for over 2 decades. And suddenly it's under attack from a president who is spreading falsehoods about vote by mail. And suddenly you see that folks that follow him are suddenly more skeptical about vote by mail. We need to restore that trust and faith in our democracy that regardless of party affiliation, I always tell folks, look, I'm fighting for your right to vote, even to vote against me. But I want to make sure that you have that right to vote, whether you're in rural Lake County or in downtown Portland. Everybody should have equal access to that ballot. But I think the job of Secretary of State that folks probably understand the least would be our role in the State Lands Board. The Secretary of State, the governor, and the treasurer actually oversee the Department of State Lands and actually run the Common School Fund, which is supposed to be for the benefit of Oregon schools. It's a smaller role of the Secretary of State's time, but it's an important role to make sure that our forest lands and our forests that are state owned here in Oregon are actually used in a way that comports with Oregon's conservation values.
Okay, thank you for that. We're going to come back to that one in that subject in just a moment. But how would you make Oregon's election system more resilient, considering the impact of what we're going through actually this year with the COVID, fires, whatnot? Resiliency has really become top of mind.
Well, first off, I want to let folks know if you have been displaced or you know someone who's been displaced, worry about all the other stuff that's on your plate right now because Vote by Mail has you covered and has had you covered for over 20 years. All folks have to do is go on to OregonVotes.org/myvote and send their ballot somewhere else by October 13th. It's very simple. And it doesn't even have to be where you know you're going to be staying. If you have a good friend who lives somewhere out of the fire zone, or if you're staying with a friend, or if you have a family member who lives somewhere that you know you can swing by, just have your ballot sent to their house. Even if you're at a county fairgrounds taking care of your livestock, you can have your ballot sent to a county fairgrounds, any identifiable location. I want to make sure folks understand that their vote, even if their mailbox burned down, their vote is secure here in Oregon. They will get their ballot. Even if after October 13, they didn't have a chance to go in because life was so busy, they can go into any county elections office, even if it's not the county where they're registered to vote, get a ballot and either take it home and cast it by mail or drop box, or they could vote right there at the county elections office. So I want folks who have so much to worry about right now, whose lives have been turned upside down, to not worry about exercising their right to vote here in Oregon. Vote by mail has you covered. So that's one important thing, is giving folks accurate information. We do a really good job here. We have paper trails. We don't have any internet access that's able to be hacked with our votes. We have forensic signature verification. We have unique barcode tracking for each ballot to make sure that folks only vote one time. But one thing that we can do to make it even more secure is, number one, shore up our online voter registration system. That is where our biggest vulnerability is. And of course, that's how folks receive their ballots, Cindy. They're registered to vote on our online system. And number two, I think we should institute ballot tracking in all 36 counties. As I'm aware, today only 3 counties, Marion, Yamhill, and Multnomah, offer ballot tracking, which is that folks can actually get a text message and when they know that their ballot has been received and counted. I get a text every time just saying, hey, your ballot's been received, it's been counted. So that confidence that folks have that their ballot has been received and counted and their voice has been heard, I think we should work on instituting that in all 36 counties.
Okay, thank you. Now turning back to the State Land Board, the Secretary of State sits on that board, which manages the land for the Common School Fund, as you mentioned. Are you satisfied with the performance of the board? And if not, what might your recommendations be for change?
Well, first off, Cindy, I'm proud to be endorsed by both the Sierra Club and the Oregon League of Conservation Voters, which are the most prominent pro-conservation environmental organizations here in our state. And it's in part because of my role on the state that would be on the State Lands Board. One thing that I'm very happy the State Land Board did not do a few years ago was sell the Elliott Forest, our large 82,000 acre old growth forest on the central coast of Oregon, which is really an Oregon treasure and needs to really comport with our conservation values. Now, of course, the Elliott Forest is in the Common School Fund, but the constitutional duty of the Common School Fund is to provide money for Oregon schools. But since the habitat concerns around the spotted owl in the Elliott Forest has not allowed logging. They have not been able to log any in the Elliott Forest, which means that the Elliott Forest actually is costing the state school fund money, and that's not appropriate. That fund, as a constitutional duty, to be for the benefit of schools, not to be costing money. And so I really support the program that is under consideration. In fact, the Oregon State University will be proposing this fall to the state land board a plan to basically, kind of decouple the state land, the Elliott Forest from the Common School Fund, and then have that managed by the Oregon State University as a research forest. And then they'll be able to work all those conservation goals for recreation, research, some limited logging that still comports with our conservation values. So they still have that forest. And so that plan is due to the state land boards this fall. And I'm really curious to see what OSU comes up with first off, because it needs to be a plan that connects with Oregon values, but what the state lands board does with that proposal.
Okay, thank you. So moving on, how will you ensure that the results of state audit that you mentioned are available to the public and that, they contribute to the improvement of government service?
Well, I'm so glad you brought up the audits division, Cindy, because as I mentioned, I grew up knowing what it's like to hang on by a thread, and we have so many families hanging on by a thread right now. And yet the Oregon Employment Department, this is a payroll tax, a benefit that folks have paid for their entire working lives. And suddenly the time that they need it, the time they need it the most, those checks haven't arrived for all Oregonians. That's unacceptable. And that's the first audit that I'll do, is of the Oregon Employment Department, and not just of what went wrong, but why were previous audits that forecast this problem? Why weren't those recommendations followed? Where did that breakdown happen? And how do we make sure it never happens again? So the audits division, yes, they do these audits and they're done very professionally. The Secretary of State works with the director of the audits division to decide what's going to be audited each year. They can do about a dozen performance audits a year, and in addition, of course, to the some audits that are done annually. And they basically assess the biggest risks facing Oregon. But then once those audits decisions are made, the Secretary of State, of course, steps back and lets the professional auditors do their work. They follow national auditing standards. And I think it's really critical the Secretary of State is not involved in that audit process, because when that information comes out the other end, it needs to be non-biased, independent, and credible, so we can act on those recommendations. But I agree, once those recommendations come out, it's totally appropriate for the Secretary of State to help advocate for those recommendations, whether to the executive branch, an agency head, or to the legislature, or to the Secretary of State's office herself, because of course we should undergo audits as well to make sure we're doing everything as well as we can. So I think that it's appropriate, once those recommendations come out, for the Secretary of State, through her legislative affairs director or personally, to actually advocate for those recommendations in those agencies in the legislature.
Okay, thank you. So we've got a campaign finance measure on the ballot this time around. And what campaign contribution limits, if any, should be set and in what areas?
Yeah, well, first of all, hallelujah. I was so proud to help send Measure 107 to the ballot. We referred that constitutional amendment to the ballot in the legislature, and I was very proud to support that. As somebody, the first time I ran for office, Cindy, as you can imagine, I didn't come from a wealthy network of folks. I didn't have a bunch of my parents' rich friends who I could call up to raise money. My first campaign, when I ran for the Oregon House, it took me 6 months of 14 hours a week of calling friends and family to raise my first $30,000, which was a really great, but that's a lot of time. And that's before I had kids. I don't know where I would find 14 hours a week to do that much calling now with an 8-year-old and a 3.5-year-old. We have got to do campaign finance reform, because it is so hard, to compete with enormous checks that one person can write $1 million check. The principles that would guide me in my campaign finance reform is, yes, there needs to be contribution limits, absolutely. And also a recognition that not all donation sources are the same. In short, one person giving $1 million is different than 1 million people giving $1. And we have to definitely recognize what I would call small donor PACs. And folks are pitching in, whether it's through an organization like Planned Parenthood or an organization like Oregon Right to Life, right? There's on the left and the right and in the middle, there are kind of good government or advocacy organizations that solicit small donations and then submit an endorsement and then give a candidate a check. Those should be treated differently than one person or one corporation just writing a giant check. And I think it's important that we also be careful to not make the contribution limit so low that we drive our campaign finance basically to independent expenditures. And you see that in some states where those contribution limits are so low that essentially the candidate has very little control over the campaign that's basically run around them, but not actually through them, and then they lose a lot of control. And I know this personally because my very first race in my first legislative race, I had an outside group come in and just make an inappropriate ad about my opponent. I don't even want to get into it because it was so inappropriate. And I had to write to them, write a public letter to them saying, please take this down. This does not reflect my campaign. This is not what I want to talk about. Plus, they got the election date wrong, which was just embarrassing. So it's very hard for candidates to control those independent expenditures. And we need to make our contribution limits reasonable so that candidates can raise enough money to actually run full campaigns and not have that campaign spending just driven out into independent expenditures.
Okay, thank you for providing a little more color to that issue. And now moving on to what I think will be our last question. In Oregon, the Secretary of State takes on the role of governor if required to do so, and we've certainly seen that. How prepared are you to take on that role?
Well, first off, this is an extraordinarily flattering question as a kid who grew up in Dufur, a town of 537 people. I feel confident in my preparedness to take over that role if necessary, because I know so many extraordinary people here in Oregon. I would look to the best and the brightest to help us lead Oregon out of this extraordinarily multiple crises on top of one another. I would look to so many great experts. And as somebody that has grown up hanging on by a thread, as somebody who knows what it's like to be out in Dufur, Oregon, and Wasco County and feel so disconnected, I would lead with my values as somebody that where it shouldn't matter where you live, how big your town is, what your gender identity, skin color, race, ethnicity, religion, language is, that we are all Oregonians, and to be somebody who's looking out for everybody, and particularly the most vulnerable among us.
Well, thank you. Your breadth from Dufur to governor would be a small kid in Dufur to governor would be good to see, I think. Following up on that, do you think we should have a lieutenant governor?
At this point, I think that it's so rare in Oregon for the lieutenant governor role to need to take over as governor. I think the Secretary of State role is doing just fine. Oregonians set that up that way in our Constitution. If a giant state, for example, like California has a lieutenant governor, but that's like the fourth or fifth largest economy in the entire world. And so I think that in a little state like Oregon, I think that the Secretary of State having that role has served Oregon really well. And at a time of plummeting revenues, we don't need to add another person into state government, to essentially would have a salary and all that would come along with that. And so I think that at this point, that role essentially lays dormant in the Secretary of State, unless called upon, which of course Kate Brown was called upon in 2015 when she became governor. But there are things that the Secretary of State can do to take that role seriously. One of my mentors, speaking of another person or a person who went from a small town to become governor, is Barbara Roberts, who's a great mentor of mine. And she grew up in Little Terrebonne, Oregon. And she actually sat in on, or had her chief of staff sitting in on, the governor's agency head meetings every week. And she asked that of Governor Goldschmidt and Governor Atiyeh, who I believe she served under both of them. And that way, in the event that she ever had to be called on, which she wasn't, of course, as lieutenant governor to step in through that automatic ascension, she would have been ready. And I think that's a great idea. And I know that Governor Brown would be open to that, regardless of who was to win this race, to have that person sitting in, because she knows what it feels like to all of a sudden, basically over the course of a plane ride, learn she's going to be governor when she flew back from the National Secretary of State's Association in January of 2015 to learn that she was going to become governor. So I have no doubt that Governor Brown would want the Secretary of State sitting in on those meetings to make sure that nobody, has to have, that feeling of being rushed again that she experienced, although she did a great job with that. Obviously, I was serving in that legislative session, and we got a lot done in that 2015 session.
Yes. Well, thank you, Shemia Fagan, for our interview today and sharing your thoughts. We're happy to have you in such a busy campaign season.
Thank you for having me, Cindy. Folks can find out more. I'm on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and at shemiafororegon.com.
Thanks to Capital Community Media for their time and expertise in creating this program and making it available across the state through YouTube and Vote 411. Thank you to the several League of Women Voters Leagues and Salem City Club members for being interviewers and suggesting questions and being interviews. And thank you to you, the public, for watching your vote count in order to become a more informed voter. For more information, including dates, registration, candidates for state and local areas, and ballot measure information, please go online to Oregon411.org. You have until October 13th to register to vote, with ballots being mailed to you beginning on October 14th. November 3rd is Election Day. Please remember that postmarks do not count. The ballots must arrive by November 3rd, 8 o'clock. Elections matter and make a difference. So remember to vote, because your vote counts.